Dharma Buddhist University was founded in 1976. It is a small liberal arts college in Northern California, found with a BA in liberal arts based in great books from East and West, a master's degree in Buddhist studies and practice, and a graduate translation certificate in the translation of Buddhist texts. If you would like more information, please go to the website www.drbu.edu. It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Brian Van Norden. Dr. Van Norden has taught for over 25 years at Vassar College in New York State. He's also taught at Wuhan University in China. He was rated as one of the best 300 professors in the US by the Princeton Review. And you can find many of his lectures on Chinese philosophers and Eastern thought freely online. Dr. Van Norden holds a PhD in philosophy from Stanford University. He is author, editor, or translator of 10 books on Chinese and comparative philosophy. Here at DRBU, we've been using several of his works in our BA curriculum, including his collection entitled Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy, co-edited with P.J. Ivanhoe in 2005. We've also recently been using his brilliant introduction to Classical Chinese for Everyone, published in 2019. To my knowledge, this is the only introductory Chinese textbook for English speakers featuring selections from the Confucian Analects as its primary source text. Dr. Van Norden's published works also include Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy, Taking Back Philosophy, a multicultural manifesto, and a co-edited anthology entitled Readings in Later Chinese Philosophy, Han to the 20th Century. Given that our curriculum here at DRBU focuses on primary sources and close reading, we are delighted to have Dr. Van Norden speak to us on the Analects, and specifically on the topic of rectification of names. I think more than one of us is very curious about his approach in today's talk, which he has entitled How Not to Rectify Names, Confucius on the Philosophy of Language. Let's all give Dr. Van Norden a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I am going to be talking about Confucius on the philosophy of language, in particular, how to rectify names or how not to rectify names. And one of the things that I wanted to stress is that although what I'm talking about is certainly of interest to people who are fascinated, as I am, with the Confucian tradition, you might be wondering, well, what if I'm not a Confucian, or what if I'm not really interested in the Confucian tradition? Why should I care about this talk? And the answer is that although I'm going to be focusing on the Confucian tradition, the kinds of issues that I'm going to be discussing and the kind of methodology that I'm going to be using is very relevant if you're interested in any spiritual or cultural tradition. So maybe you're a Buddhist and you're interested in understanding the sutras, or you're a Christian and you're interested in understanding the Bible, or you're a Muslim and you're interested in understanding the Quran, or you're Jewish and interested in understanding the Talmud. Any of those things, or many other traditions, there are classic texts that you're trying to understand, and there are sincere, intelligent people who've tried to understand those same texts, and sometimes they're going to come up with different interpretations from yours. And how should you deal with these differences in interpretation? So even if you're not really interested specifically in the Confucian tradition, the kinds of methods and the kinds of issues I'm illustrating with this example will still be relevant to you. So let's take a look at it. So in this lecture, I'm going to give you a sense of how people nowadays typically interpret a particular passage in the Analects, the sayings of Confucius, Analects 13.3. Then I'm going to say something about the dramatic context of Analects 13.3. In other words, taking for granted that the passage is about a particular time in a particular context, what was that context that the passage is supposed to be about? Then I'm going to look at some theories about the date of composition of the passage, right? So it's one question to ask, when is a passage supposed to have taken place? When is a dialogue supposed to have taken place? And then a separate question to ask, well, when was that dialogue actually written down? Then I'm going to look a little bit at the history of interpretations of Analects 13.3, and I'm going to conclude with some general lessons that I think we can learn by thinking about all these things we've been through. But first of all, what is the relevant passage? Analects 13.3. In the passage, it begins with a disciple of Confucius, Zulu, saying, if the Duke of Wei were to employ you to serve in the government of his state, what would be your first priority? The master, and that means Confucius or Kongzi, as he's known in Chinese, answered, it would, of course, be the rectification of names, zhengming. Rectification of names is sometimes also translated correcting names in English. Zulu said, could you, master, really be so far off the mark? Why worry about rectifying names? The master replied, how boorish you are, Zulu. When it comes to matters that he does not understand, the gentleman should remain silent. The passage continues, if names are not rectified, speech will not be appropriate. When speech is not appropriate, things will not be successfully accomplished. When things are not successfully accomplished, ritual and music will fail to flourish. When ritual and music fail to flourish, punishments and penalties will miss the mark. And when punishments and penalties miss the mark, the common people will be at a loss as to what to do with themselves. This is why the gentleman only applies names that can be properly spoken and assures that what he says can be properly put into action. The gentleman simply guards against arbitrariness in speech. This is all there is to it. So what is rectifying names? One common interpretation is that rectifying names is about making names and things appropriate to one another. And when we talk about names here, we don't just mean proper names like Brian or Sarah or whoever. We mean names, really nouns in general, especially nouns that refer to social roles or official positions. And what does it mean to make names in this sense and things appropriate to one another? There's really two aspects to it. First, it involves reforming naming practices, the way we use these names, so that they are appropriate for the objects that are named. And secondly, it involves reforming the objects that the names refer to so that they're appropriate for the names that are used of them. Well, that's a little abstract, so let's look at some concrete examples of passages in Confucian texts that are thought to illustrate these two ways in which we bring names and things into conjunction. Oh, and by the way, my French bulldog my pet is sleeping at my feet and he's snoring right now. So if you're hearing a little snoring in the background, that's my dog. So Mengzi 1b8, this is another Confucian classic, records a dialogue between King Xuan of Qi and this Confucian thinker Mengzi. King Xuan of Qi asked, is it the case that Tong banished tyrant Jie and that Wu struck down tyrant Zhou? So Tong was the sage who founded the Shang dynasty, and Jie was the evil last ruler of the Xia dynasty, and Tong overthrew tyrant Jie, and Wu was the sage who founded the Zhou dynasty, and tyrant Zhou was the evil last ruler of the Shang dynasty. And so what King Xuan of Qi is asking is it true that Tong banished Jie and Wu struck down tyrant Zhou? And Mengzi responded, there are such accounts in the historical records. The king said, is it acceptable for subjects to kill their rulers? And what he's asking is, well, look, although Tong was a sage and Jie was a tyrant, Jie was the reigning monarch when Tong banished Jie. And although Zhou was a tyrant, Zhou was the reigning monarch of the Shang when Wu killed him. So is it acceptable for subjects to kill their rulers? And Mengzi's response is, one who violates benevolence should be called a thief. One who violates righteousness is called a mutilator. A mutilator and thief is called a mere fellow. I've heard of the execution of a mere fellow Zhou, but I have not heard of the killing of one's ruler. So in other words, we shouldn't call Jie a king or a ruler. We shouldn't call tyrant Zhou a king or a ruler. They don't deserve the title of king, Wang, because they're not acting like a king. And so some people have interpreted this as an illustration of one way in which we rectify names. Another passage that's often used as an illustration of rectifying names is this one in the Analects, the sayings of Confucius. The master said, a goo that is not a goo, what a goo, what a goo. Now that sounds, I know, very obscure, but the meaning most commentators think is that we know that a goo is a kind of drinking vessel that people would use in ancient China. And it looked something like one of these illustrations here. And apparently during Kongzi or Confucius's lifetime, people were using as a goo a vessel that didn't meet the precise ritual description of an authentic goo vessel. The commentators have various explanations for this. The most intriguing one I've heard is that the goo was originally a small sipping cup that you would use for sipping wine during a ritual. And people wanted to drink more wine. And so instead of this tiny sipping cup, they made a big cup in the same shape that could hold a lot more wine so they could chug the wine and get drunk. And Confucius was upset that people were calling this chugging glass that you could get drunk on a goo, when a proper goo was just a sipping glass for having a little bit of wine just as part of a ceremony and not for actually getting drunk. So the idea is, again, you shouldn't use the term goo to refer to a big goblet that you use for chugging wine. You should use it to describe the small sipping cup that you use as part of the official ritual. Now, the other direction of rectifying names, we were talking about adjusting the way we use names to be appropriate for the objects, but you could also reform objects to suit the names. And one passage that's thought to illustrate this is Analects 12:11. Duke Jing of Qi asked Kongzi, Confucius, about governing. Kongzi replied, let the rulers be rulers, let the ministers be ministers, let the fathers be fathers, and let the sons be sons. The Duke replied, excellent. If the rulers are not rulers, the ministers not ministers, the fathers not fathers, and the sons not sons, even if there is grain, will I get to eat it? So the idea here is, if you have the title of ruler, you should act like a ruler. That is to say, you should rule for the well-being of the common people, and you should be responsible and just in carrying out your job. If you bear the title of minister, government minister, you should give advice that is directed at the well-being of the state and the well-being of the people, and not just as self-aggrandizing or making yourself rich. If you bear the title father, you should live up to that title, and you should be a kind moral guide and provider for your children. If you're a son, you should live up to that title and be respectful of your father and learn from him and support him. Interestingly, I taught my kids, they're adults now, But when they were young, I taught them a little bit of classical Chinese. And when they were just in grade school, I taught them both this passage in Chinese. And my daughter said, so he told the fathers they should act like fathers, and he told the sons to act like sons. I noticed, my daughter said, that he doesn't mention the mommies and the daughters. That must be because the mommies and daughters were already doing the right thing and they didn't need to be told to do the right thing. I was very pleased that she had that much self-confidence that she thought that. And I unfortunately had to tell her, no, it's probably just a little sexism in the tradition that they didn't mention the mothers and the daughters, but in any case. So rectifying names involves changing the way you use names so that you name things appropriately. Don't call a chugging cup of wine a goo when a goo is really just a sipping cup of wine for a ritual purpose. But also when something bears a title or a name, it should live up to that title or name. So if you're a father, act like a father. If you're a ruler, act like a ruler. Now, how might this apply to us in the contemporary world? Well, let's talk about reforming naming practices so they're appropriate for the objects named. I'm a professional philosopher, and people often throw the title of philosopher around a lot. So, for example, Ayn Rand, who's a notoriously bad philosopher, is what some people think of as a genuine philosopher. There are some celebrities around nowadays that people think of as philosophers. But if we're going to rectify names, we should reserve the name philosopher for people who are actually good philosophers. And instead of calling Ayn Rand a philosopher, we should reserve the term for really good philosophers like Martha Nussbaum at the University of Chicago. And instead, we should call people like Ayn Rand what they really are, which is sophists, which is a term for a kind of fake philosopher. Now, you may not agree with my example, but surely we can agree that there are cases where people are called by a certain title that they don't really deserve. What about reforming objects so they're appropriate for the names that are used of them? Well, let's take the term family. And here, the example that I'm going to give, I'm going to date myself a little bit here. I'm going to show how old I am. This is, you might not recognize these people, but this is the man on the far left here is Ozzy Osbourne. He's a famous heavy metal rock and roll star. And he and his family are an early example of what's called reality television in the United States, where you send a camera crew to follow around an ordinary family and just record what happens to them. And it turns out that if the family is colorful enough, people often enjoy watching that. So The Osbournes was a reality television show about Ozzy Osbourne and his son and his daughter and his wife. And as you can see, as this photo suggests, that was a family that had a lot of tension and they fought a lot and they got into a lot of trouble. And that's why people enjoyed watching the show. So if we're going to rectify names, one thing we should do, since this is a family, is they should live up to the term family and be a good family. And so this shows the same family, the Osbourne, after they've cleaned up their act, so to speak, and they're getting along better and they're dressing better and they're a more healthy family. So that's an example of how we might apply rectifying names today. If you're a family, try to be a fun, healthy family instead of a dysfunctional family. Now, interestingly, the early Confucian philosopher Xunzi, he lived a couple centuries after Kongzi, Confucius himself, but he actually has an essay on rectifying names and talks about what he thinks it is and why he thinks it is important. So Xunzi says, so when the kings, meaning he means the sage kings, established names, the names were fixed and the corresponding objects were thus distinguished. This way was followed, and the king's intentions were thus understood. They then carefully led the people to adhere to these things single-mindedly. So Xunzi is saying that one important aspect of rectifying names is using names correctly so that the king's intentions for how you should behave will be understood. He continues, thus they called it great vileness to mince words and recklessly create names so as to disorder the rectified names and thereby confuse the people and cause them to engage in much disputation in litigation. This wrongdoing was considered to be just like the crime of forging tallies and measures. So just like in a market, you want to have tallies and weights and measures that are objective and that everybody agrees on and uses so you can't be cheated. So you have to have names used correctly so that people know what is expected of them and that so people are described accurately. Xunzi goes on, because none of the people dared rely on making up strange names so as to disorder the rectified names, they were unified in following the proper model of the way and were conscientious in following commands. Nowadays, though, the sage kings have passed away and the preservation of these names has become lax. Strange words have arisen, the names and their corresponding objects are disordered, and the forms of right and wrong are unclear. So Xunzi obviously thinks that by the time Xunzi's writing, which is near the end of the Warring States period, so in the late 3rd century BCE, clearly rectifying names is considered important. Now, what are some of the consequences of the failure to rectify names? Well, again, I'm showing how old I am here with this reference. This is a picture from the Jerry Springer Show, which was a notorious talk show that used to be on American television for many years. And what was distinctive about the Jerry Springer Show is that they would interview people who were just terrible and had done terrible things and typically didn't have any shame about it at all. So for example, I remember one episode where they had on a family and the mother-in-law, the mother in the family had had an affair with her son-in-law. And if that weren't bad enough, the grandmother, the mother's mother, had also had an affair with her grandson-in-law. And none of these people were at all ashamed or embarrassed about what they had done. And they got into a huge fight on television. Well, this example is horrible, but from a
就是
Confucian
不伦的关系。
one way of
那么从孔子看来呢，
son-in-law was not acting like a son-in-law.
那这女婿不像女婿，岳母不像岳母，那那位祖母不像祖母，
None of them were doing what was appropriate for the titles or the names that went with their social roles. So I think there's some agreement that the things I've talked about so far are part of rectifying names. You want to use names appropriately of things. If someone's a sophist, call them a sophist, don't call them a philosopher. If someone's a philosopher, though, if they've earned that title, call them a philosopher. On the other hand, you should live up to the names that are appropriate to you. So if you're a student, be a good student. If you're a teacher, be a good teacher. If you're a mother, be a good mother. If you're a son, be a good son. But some scholars think there's a third aspect of rectifying names, which I haven't touched on yet. So for example, the distinguished scholar John Makem says, there are many passages in the Analects that deal with the correction of names, even though they do not employ the specific term zhengbing. Further, Frederick W. Mote, who wrote a very influential history of Chinese thought, said that correcting names is a functional concept throughout the Analects. Even stronger, A.C. Graham, one of the greatest 20th century scholars of Chinese thought, said that the successful functioning of Confucian society in general depends on each person doing what rightly used names instruct him to do. And perhaps most extreme, Benjamin Schwartz, a former professor at Harvard, he passed away a few years ago, but he wrote a very good history of Chinese philosophy in the ancient period. And he said that correcting names was a preoccupation that marked the entire subsequent development of pre-Qin Chinese thought. So I've arranged these in increasing order of how extreme the claim they make is, but they claim either that correcting names is a much more important concept in the Analects than it might appear to be from the number of times it's cited, or in fact, all of Confucian philosophy depends on correcting names. And indeed, some people like Benjamin Schwartz said, not just Confucian philosophy, but the entire early development of Chinese philosophy was influenced by the concept of correcting names. So there's three claims about correcting names: that reforming naming practices is important so that the names are appropriate to the objects named, that you should reform objects or things so that they live up to the names that we use of them. And then some people claim that rectifying names is a central concept in the Analects, and indeed perhaps a central concept in early Chinese thought in general. I agree with the first two claims. I disagree with the third claim. And so part of what I'm going to be exploring in the latter parts of this talk is why I think that rectifying names is not a central concept throughout the Analects, and actually isn't that important of a concept in a lot of early Chinese thought. Now, to explain why, I think we have to look first at the dramatic context of the passage in question, Analects 13.3. So Analects 13.3, we quoted it at the beginning of the talk. It purports to be a dialogue between Zulu, a disciple of Confucius, and he's asking him about the situation in the state of Wei, and then Confucius gives his opinion about it. Well, the dramatic context of a work is, when is this work or this dialogue or this play supposed to have taken place? And that's different from when the work was written down. So for example, Shakespeare wrote a play, Julius Caesar. The dramatic context for Julius Caesar is the life of Julius Caesar in ancient Rome. But Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, wasn't written then. It was written in the probably the early 17th century, in the 1600s. But what's the dramatic context for this passage and the dialogue that we saw is in 13.3? Well, in the year 496 BCE, we know that Duke Ling is the ruler of the state of Wei, and Nanzi is his wife. Now, Nanzi has a reputation for being licentious. She supposedly cheated on the Duke a lot. Now, historically, often when women have positions of political power, people spread malicious gossip behind their back. So I don't know whether these rumors about Nanzi were true. Maybe they weren't, but those were the rumors that circulated at the time. And as a result of these rumors, the Duke's son, Kwai Kwei, who was the stepson of Nanzi, tried to murder her. And the Nanzi's stepson, Kwai Kwei, failed in his effort to murder her, and he fled the state. And this all happened in 496 BCE. Then, a few years later, in 493 BCE, Duke Ling died and was succeeded on the throne by his grandson, Zhe, who was Kwai Kwei's son, and Zhe then became the new Duke Chu of the state of Wei. But then Kwai Kwei attempted to return to assume the dukeship, but his son Zhe dispatched troops to prevent his father from returning and assuming the dukedom. Later, in 489 BCE, Zilu was an official in the state of Wei, and this is when Kongzi visited. So 489 BC, around this time, is the dramatic date of this dialogue that we saw in 13.3, and this is the political context at that time. Now, if you want to understand anything that Kongzi says, I think one of the important things you have to keep in mind is context sensitivity. And I'm going to take a look at another passage in the Analects to illustrate this point. So in Analects 11:22 is one of my favorite passages in the Analects. In this passage, a disciple, Zilu again, comes to Confucius and asks him for advice about an issue. And Confucius gives him his advice. The Zilu leaves. Another disciple, Ran Cho, comes in and asks the very same question in the very same words. And Confucius gives opposite advice to Ran Cho from the advice that he'd given to Zilu. Now, a third disciple has heard both exchanges and asks the question that we would probably ask it well if we were in this situation. Namely, Zihua inquired, when Zilu asked you whether or not one should immediately take care of something upon learning of it, you told him one should not, as long as one's father and elder brothers were still alive. When Ran Cho asked the same question, however, you told him that one should immediately take care of it. I'm confused and humbly asked to have this explained to me. The master, Kongzi, said, well, Ran Cho is overly cautious, and so I wish to urge him on. Zilu, on the other hand, is too impetuous, and so I sought to hold him back. So this little passage becomes the basis of a lot of later Confucian teaching and attitudes towards language. And what it illustrates is that whatever Confucius says is very context sensitive and is responsive to the needs of his interlocutor, the person that he's talking to there. So Confucius isn't always making general pronouncements. He's often making pronouncements that are context sensitive, keyed to the needs of the particular person he's talking to. Now, let's think again about the situation in the state of Wei when Kongzi visited. So this is the family tree of the ruling family. There was Duke Ling, who was the father of Kuai Kuei, and the husband of Nanzi. Nanzi was Duke Ling's wife, but she was also the stepmother of Kuai Kuei. Kuai Kuei, in addition to being the son of Duke Ling and the stepson of Nanzi, was the father of Zhe, his son, and Zhe was also the grandson of Duke Ling. But again, we don't know whether it's true, but the rumor was that Nanzi was cheating on her husband, Duke Ling, and so she wasn't living up to the title of wife in treating her own husband. At the same time, Kuai Kuei tried to murder his stepmother, so he wasn't living up to the title of stepson in the way that he treated his own stepmother. But then after Kuai Kuei had to flee the state, and then his son ascended to the throne, instead of supporting his son, he tried to come back in and force his son off the throne. But then the son, instead of acceding to his father's wishes, sent an army to chase his father away. So Zhe wasn't acting like a good son to his father, even though admittedly Kuai Kuei wasn't being a good father to his own son either. So in this situation, what would Kongzi mean in talking about rectifying names? It seems to me that Analects 13.3 is a comment on the political situation in Wei, in which people were not living up to their role-specific titles like husband, wife, father, son, stepson, stepmother, rather than a general statement about social policy. I think that makes the most sense if we keep the dramatic context of the event in mind. So that's the first claim I hope I can convince you of. Now let's turn to the issue of the date of composition of the passage. Again, the dramatic date, we know it's, was it 493 BCE, about then? But when was it actually composed or written down? Well, to think about that, we have to think about the general composition of the Analects. Analects is an English name for the Chinese work, the Lunyu, which probably means something like categorized sayings, although there's some debate about that. And if you want to read the Analects in English, my recommendation is to use my former classmate and friend Edward Slingerland's translation of the Analects, because it not only translates the text of the Analects, but it also includes selections from traditional Chinese commentaries on the Analects, so you can understand how this work was interpreted in the Chinese tradition. Now, I first read the Analects in the translation of James Legge. James Legge was a Victorian era missionary who took it upon himself to translate the 4 books, the Su Shu of the Confucian tradition, but also most of the Wu Jing, the 5 classics. And Legge's translation is a little, the English is a little old-fashioned now, but Legge often follows the interpretation of Zhu Xi, which was the Orthodox interpretation, and Legge's translation includes the Chinese text and interpretive notes, so that's very convenient. There are a bunch of other translations. I think Arthur Waley's translation is also a very elegant English translation done in the, I think it was originally published in the 1930s. But if you looked at the original text of the Analects, what would you find? The Analects is divided into 20 books. We call them in English, but these books are really the length of chapters. And then if you looked in any one of the 20 books of the Analects, you'd find it divided into what we call chapters in English. But as you can see, this is the opening of book 1. The chapters are really just sometimes 1 sentence long, sometimes a few sentences long. The longest passages are a few paragraphs long. So the Analects has 20 books that are we call them in English, that are really the length of what we call English chapters. And then each book is divided into what we call in English chapters, which are really pretty short in most cases, sometimes 1 sentence or a few sentences, or at most a few paragraphs long. So that's what you'll find if you look into the Analects. Okay, so then which parts of the Analects may be accurately attributed to Kongzi, Confucius, and his immediate disciples? The traditional view is that all of books 1 through 20 were written down soon after the death of Kongzi by his immediate disciples, and that went unchallenged for a long time. The Japanese scholar Ito Jinsai divided the Analects into the upper Analects of books 1 through 10 and the lower Analects of books 11 through 20. And in fairness, when you read the Analects, it does seem like there's something different in between books 1 through 10 and 11 through 20. The number of long passages with long dialogues increases in books 11 through 20. Also, book 10 in the Analects seems like an important dividing point, because a lot of book 10 reads like a manual on ritual that somehow got stuck into the middle of the book. Traditionally, book 10 is said to be largely a description of the behavior of Kongzi himself. But if you look at it objectively, it seems like it's more like a manual on ritual that somehow got interpolated into the middle of the text. Later in the Qing dynasty, the Chinese scholar Cui Shu argued that books 1 through 15 are closer to the time of Confucius, and books 16 through 20 are later. And Cui Shu had some pretty good arguments for this. He pointed out that there are grammatical and linguistic factors in books 16 through 20 that suggest a much later date. Arthur Whaley, whose translation I recommended earlier, made an offhand comment that he thought books 3 through 9 were the earliest stratum in the text. Unfortunately, he didn't give an argument for why he thought that. He just asserted it. But you know, there's some plausibility to that claim. A few years ago, the scholars Bruce and Tycho Brooks published a work, the original Analects, and they argued that only part of book 4 in the Analects, chapters 1 through 14 and 16 and 17, were authentically Confucius. And Bruce and Tycho argued that all the rest of the Analects was later additions that had been added, kind of like choral, gradually building up, accreting around a core text of the first half of book 4. Then recently, a very extreme view has been defended by my friend Michael Hunter at Yale in his work Confucius Beyond the Analects. And Mick Hunter says, no, none of the received Analects is authentically from Confucius. Hunter believes that the Analects as we have it was composed entirely in the Han Dynasty and is not an authentic text at all. Now, I have to say, I don't find the views of Bruce and Tycho Brooks or the view of Hunter compelling. Hunter's argument he's got several arguments, but the one that's gotten the most attention is Hunter points out that the Analects, there's not a lot of quotations of the received text of the Analects in texts before the Han Dynasty. And that's true, but the reason it's not a good argument is that we have a very small sample size of texts that come before the Han Dynasty, because most books that were written before the Han Dynasty were burned when Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of the Qin, tried to wipe out all books of rival philosophical schools. So we don't have a large enough sample size of pre-Qin texts to arrive at any conclusions about the number of times the Analects is cited in other texts. In addition, in order to give a statistical argument, you have to not only have a large enough sample size, you need to know that that sample is representative of the text that existed before the Han Dynasty. But there's selection bias in which texts survived. It's not like the texts that survived are a random sample. They represent somebody's view about which text it was important to preserve. And so there's no reason at all to think that the texts we have from the pre-Qin period are representative. So the fact that there are not too many quotations from the received Analects in pre-Han texts really doesn't prove much of anything. I think there are also some very good reasons to think that the received text of the Analects is in fact a 5th century BCE work. And some of these arguments were developed originally by my friend and colleague, Ted Slingerland, but I've added some of them that are my own. So if we look at the text of the Analects, think about it in terms of later developments in Chinese thought. By the 4th century BCE, central to philosophical debate were concepts such as Xing, nature, especially human nature, and Qi, the fundamental stuff out of which everything is composed. And by the Western Han Dynasty, when Hunter, for example, thinks the Analects was forged, yin-yang, these cosmological concepts, and the Wu Xing, the 5 phases, and the concept of Li, pattern, were also central to philosophical debate. But if we look in the received text of the Analects, look at the following occurrences. The term qi, which, as I say, is central to debates in China by the 4th century BCE, occurs only 6 times. 2 of those occurrences are in book 10, which we saw is already a weird book. It looks like a manual on ritual that got interpolated into the text. And then 3 of the occurrences of qi are in book 16, which is in the part of the text that Cui Shu identified as being really late. The term Xing, human nature, which again, everybody's talking about by the 4th century BCE, and it's very widely discussed in the Han Dynasty, occurs in only 2 passages in the Analects. One of those passages is in book 17, Cui Shu's late stratum. The other occurrence is in book 5, and in book 5, one of Confucius's disciples tells us that Confucius never discussed this. But if you were forging this text at a later period, of course you would have put comments about human nature into the mouth of Confucius. Yin and yang never occurs in the technical cosmological sense in the Analects. Wuxing, the 5 phases, never occurs in the Analects, and Li, pattern, never occurs in the Analects. This is really bizarre if this text were actually forged or even came into existence in the 4th century BC or later. So I think you can make a pretty good case that the Analects as we have it, it was composed within a few decades after the death of Confucius in the 5th century BCE. But what about Analects 13.3? Is it representative of the thought of the rest of the Analects? Well, Arthur Whaley has argued that 13.3 is an interpolation, a passage that is not representative of Confucius's thought, but represents the thought of later philosophers. Whaley said Analects 13.3 is an interpolation on the part of Xunzi or his school. And remember, we saw that the later Confucian Xunzi, who lived in the late 3rd century BCE, did have an essay on rectifying names. And so Whaley says this is an interpolation on the part of Xunzi or his school, for whom the absence of any reference in the sayings of Kungzi to what they themselves taught as a fundamental doctrine must certainly have been inconvenient. And Whaley mentions some things that are unusual about Analects 13.3, and I'd like to add to that list. So Analects 13.3 is written in a distinctive chain argument style. If A, then B. If B, then C. If C, then D. This style is characteristic of later Warring States and Western Han Dynasty texts, but it's not characteristic of the rest of the Analects. So what do I mean by this style? Well, remember these lines. If names are not rectified, speech will not be in accordance. When speech is not in accordance, things will not be successfully accomplished. That's a style that we see in lots of texts that date from late in the Warring States period or in the early Han Dynasty. For example, the classic section of the Great Learning, which most scholars now would date to the late Warring States period, includes lines like, when one knows the place to rest, only then is one settled. When one is settled, only then is one able to be tranquil. When one is tranquil, only then is one able to be at peace. That's an example of the chain argument style. Another weird thing about 13.3 is if correcting names is a central teaching of Kungzi, why is Zilu, who's one of the closest disciples to the master, so shocked when the master brings it up? Remember, Zilu said, "Could you, master, really be so far off the mark? Why worry about rectifying names?" And the master replied, "How boorish you are, Zilu." Now, this rhetorical device of anticipating an objection in the text is known by the technical name of prolepsis. And prolepsis is a technique you use when you know your reader is going to be surprised by something and you try to head that off in one way or another. So it seems like whoever composed 13.3 knew that people would be surprised to hear Confucius talking about rectifying names. And so they put the objection into the mouth of Zilu, only to have him swatted down by the master for being boorish for raising such an objection. But again, if people are right that rectifying names was a central concept throughout the Analects or was central to all of Confucian thought, why is Zulu surprised by it? Another unusual aspect of 13.3 is the use of the term name. The term Ming, name, occurs only 8 times in all of the Analects. 3 of these 8 occurrences are in passage 13.3 itself. One more occurrence is in book 17.9, which again, that's in the stratum of the text, book 16 through 20, that Cui Shu identified as late. So 17.9 says, the odes also broadly acquaint you with the names, Ming, of various birds, beasts, plants, and trees. Now, what about the other occurrences of Ming in the Analects? In every other occurrence, Ming means fame or good reputation. For example, in book 9.2, someone sarcastically remarks, how great is Kongze? He is so broadly learned and yet has failed to make a name for himself, Chengming, in any particular endeavor. So in the parts of the Analects that we know are early, or we have good reason to believe are early, Ming means fame or good reputation. It's only in 13.3 itself and in one of the later books of the Analects that the term Ming is actually used in the sense of a name or a title, as opposed to meaning fame or good reputation. So that's another anomaly of 13.3. So I tried to argue that Analects 13.3 is likely to be a comment on the political situation in the state of Wei, not a general statement about social policy, if we consider its dramatic context and what we know about the way in which Confucius tempers his comments to the needs of his interlocutor. Analects 13.3 is also an anomalous passage in the text, suggesting that it was added fairly late. Now, it's often useful in thinking about a particular passage to look at the history of the way people have interpreted it. And one thing I discovered many years ago is that there's a really interesting history behind the way in which people in English understand passage 13.3. And that story goes back to this guy, Hu Shi. Hu Shi was one of the leading intellectuals in the New Culture movement and the May 4th movement in China, which was a movement of 20th century Chinese intellectuals calling on China to modernize and adopt Western-style natural science, capitalistic economics, and Western-style representative democracy. And Hu Shi was a major figure in this. Hu Shi came to the United States. He originally came to study, I think it was agricultural policy or farming technology, but then he switched his major in the United States to philosophy. And he got a doctorate in philosophy in the United States. And his doctoral dissertation became this book, The Development of the Logical Method in Ancient China. Now, in this book, Hu Shi tells a story about the development of logic and the philosophy of language in China in ancient times. And Hu Shi was very open about his agenda in writing this book. Hu Shi said, where can we find a congenial stock with which we Chinese may organically link the thought systems of modern Europe and America so that we may further build up our own science and philosophy on a new foundation of the internal assimilation of the old and the new. My interest in the rediscovery of the logical theories and methods of ancient China is primarily a pedagogical one. I have the strongest desire to make my own people see that these methods of the West are not totally alien to the Chinese mind. In other words, Hu Shi said he's looking in ancient Chinese thought for things that look like Western philosophy and Western logic, so he can help convince fellow Chinese people that they are not being unfaithful to their tradition by adopting Western philosophy because it had been anticipated in their own tradition. And one of the things Husserl stresses in his account of the development of Chinese thought is Zhengming. Indeed, in his outline history of Chinese philosophy, he said in Chinese that what he calls name correctionism, Zhengming Zhuyi, is the central issue of Kongzi's teachings. And why does he say that? Because he's looking to try to find in Chinese thought something that reminds him of Western philosophy. Now, within 20th century Chinese philosophy, Husserl's work had a huge influence, and it influenced a lot of thinkers. And one of the thinkers it influenced was this guy, Feng Youlan. And Feng Youlan, in his autobiography, says he was really amazed when he read Husserl's work, and many people in his generation were really stunned by it. And Feng Youlan himself went to the United States and studied philosophy in the United States, just like Husserl did. And then he went back to China and he wrote a history of Chinese philosophy. And inspired by Husserl, Feng Youlan read Western philosophy into the history of Chinese philosophy. And this is what leads Feng Youlan to say, and this is in the English version of his book, A History of Chinese Philosophy. Feng Youlan says, every name, Ming, possesses its own definition, which designates that which makes the thing to which the name is applied be that thing and no other. In other words, the name is that thing's essence or concept. And if you know about Western style Platonism, this is precisely a version of Western style Platonism read back into the Chinese tradition. What is pointed out by the definition of the name ruler, for example, is that essence which makes a ruler, right? So jun jun, chun chun, fu fu, zi zi. In the phrase, let the ruler be ruler, etc., the first word ruler refers to ruler as a material actuality, while the second ruler is the name and concept of the ideal ruler. Likewise for the other terms, minister, father, and son. Now, Feng Youlan he studied philosophy in the United States. He was inspired by Husserl, who also studied philosophy in the United States. And then Feng Youlan goes back and writes a history of Chinese philosophy in Chinese, inspired by Western philosophy. That book is translated into English by a Western scholar, Dirk Body, and it went on to become the best-selling history of Chinese philosophy for decades in the West. Now, why did Feng Youlan, the English translation of Feng Youlan's history of Chinese philosophy, sell so well in the West? Well, I think people thought, oh, this is great. It's a history of Chinese philosophy by a Chinese thinker, Feng Youlan. And so people thought they're getting an authentic Chinese interpretation of the tradition instead of a fake Western one. But the irony is that both Husserl and Feng Youlan were deeply influenced by Western philosophy, and I think they projected their understanding of Western philosophy onto Chinese philosophy, which influenced the way they understood the rectification of names and the emphasis they gave to the rectification of names. So I think that Analects 13.3 is a comment on the political situation in the state of Wei, not a general statement about social policy. I think it's a kind of anomalous or unusual passage in the text, suggesting that it was added fairly late in the composition of the Analects. And I'd like to argue that the contemporary belief that rectifying names is a central concept in the Analects resulted from Husserl and Feng Youlan reading back into the Analects, the analytic philosophy of language they learned when they studied in the US. Well, what would Husserl and Feng Youlan have learned when they were studying in the United States in the early part of the 20th century? One of the most influential philosophers in this period was Bertrand Russell, who's a British philosopher, but his philosophy is to this day very widely studied in English-speaking philosophy departments. And in particular, one of the things for which Russell is most famous is his work on denoting, which some people have said is a paradigm of how you should do philosophy. So what is on denoting about? Well, Russell considers the sentence, "The present king of France is not bald." Now, of course, there is no present king of France. And so Russell says, okay, so the statement, "The present king of France is not bald," seems like it's a meaningful statement, but how is it meaningful when there is no referent for the expression, "the present king of France"? And Russell says, if you understand the underlying logical structure of this sentence, the underlying logical structure is, the problem is the present king of France does not refer to anyone. So how is the sentence meaningful? And Russell says, well, the underlying logical structure of the sentence is different from its surface structure. In logical notation, the underlying logical structure of the sentence, "The present king of France is not bald," is there exists an X such that X is a king, and for all Y, if Y is a king, then Y is the same as X, and X is not bald. Now, in ordinary language, and I've copied the red part in the formalism into a red phrase in English just so you can see what work that part of the formalism is doing. Russell says when you say the present king of France is not bald, what you mean is there exists something that is the present king of France, and there is at most one thing like this, and that thing is not bald. And that statement is false. Now, you say a lot about why Russell cared about sentences like this and why people thought this was a real breakthrough in philosophy. But the point is, both Husserl and Feng Youlan would have been exposed to this. How would that have influenced how they read passages in the Analects? Well, let's look at a couple of the passages that we read. So one phrase we find in the Analects is "jun bu jun," a ruler is not a ruler. And another phrase we find is "gu bu gu," a gu is not a gu. Now, if you were trained in Western philosophy and you encounter the phrase "a ruler is not a ruler," you think, well, literally what that means is there exists an X such that X is a ruler and X is not a ruler. But that seems problematic if you're a Western trained philosopher because the statement appears to be contradictory. So the solution that will occur to you if you're raised in this kind of intellectual tradition is, oh, we have to think to what the underlying logical form is. And the underlying logical form is something like, there exists a person who is called a ruler who is not actually a ruler. Same thing with "a gu is not a gu." Literally, in formal logic, that's there exists an X such that X is a gu and X is not a gu. But that appears to be contradictory. And according to Western style philosophy, contradictions can't be true. So the underlying logical form has to be something like, there exists a thing that is called a gu that is not a gu. Now, I know I've dragged you through some very technical philosophy here, but the important thing to see is if you're trained in a certain style of philosophy, it seems obvious to you that when you say something like "a ruler is not a ruler," you must mean something like there's a person who's called a ruler who isn't really a ruler. Or if you say "a gu is not a gu," you must mean there's something called a gu that isn't really a gu. But do you have to read the passage in that way? Well, let's take this line again. A ruler is not a ruler, a minister is not a minister, a father is not a father, a son is not a son. What if we interpreted that without talking about names and instead said, well, maybe what this passage is saying is just that the relationships between rulers, ministers, fathers, and sons had all lost the way. which notice doesn't refer to Ming names at all. Well, would any Chinese interpreter understand the passage that way? Yes, in fact, Zhu Xi, who's the orthodox interpreter of the 4 books, the Si Shu, that's exactly how Zhu Xi explains that line from the Analects. Zhu Xi doesn't refer to names at all in explaining how that passage works. Well, what about a gu is not a gu? Well, you might interpret that by saying, well, a gu that has lost its regulation shape is not a gu. I'm referring to this one vessel, but everything in the world is the same way. Hence, a ruler who has lost the way of a ruler is not a ruler. A minister who has lost the responsibilities of a minister occupies an empty role. That is the interpretation of that line offered by Chang'e. And what I want you to notice is, again, Chang'e doesn't talk about names here. So the fact that many philosophers have thought that these passages were really about names might just reflect the intellectual context in which people like Hu Shi and Feng Youlan and the other English language philosophers who followed them were trained to think about apparently contradictory passages. So what am I claiming? I think Analects 13.3 is a comment on the political situation in a way, not a general statement about social policy. It's an anomalous passage in the text, suggesting that it was added fairly late. The contemporary belief that rectifying names is a central concept in the Analects resulted from Hu Shi and Feng Youlan reading back into the Analects, the analytic philosophy of language they learned when they studied in the US. And many of the passages that Hu Shi, Feng Youlan, and others have claimed were about rectifying names do not, in fact, discuss names or what something is called at all. So they are not evidence that rectifying names was a central concept in the Analects. So what lessons have we learned from this little adventure into understanding this passage? And what can you take from this particular case to other traditions that you might be interested in, whether they're Buddhism or Islam or Judaism or Christianity or Hinduism or whatever? Well, I'm very influenced by the hermeneutic tradition, and one of the great thinkers in the hermeneutic tradition is Hans-Georg Gadamer, who wrote Truth and Method. And in Truth and Method, Gadamer said, a person who is trying to understand a text is always projecting. He projects a meaning for the text as a whole as soon as some initial meaning emerges in the text. Again, the initial meaning emerges only because he is reading the text with particular expectations in regard to a certain meaning. So there's no way of reading a text without bringing some preconceptions to it and projecting those preconceptions onto the text. Does that mean there aren't better and worse ways to read a text? No, there are better and worse ways to read a text. Because, as Gadamer also says, it's the tyranny of hidden prejudices that makes us deaf to what speaks to us in tradition. In other words, we have to project a meaning onto the text, but when we project a meaning onto the text, we should be aware of what preconceptions we brought to the text. For example, you might have a preconception that if someone says a ruler is not a ruler, they must mean that someone called a ruler is not really a ruler. Why? Because maybe that's a prejudice that you brought to the text. So my final thesis is we must make assumptions about the meaning of a text in order to begin to understand it. However, we must be willing to revise our assumptions in the light of what we discover as we read. In addition, we can do a better job of revising our assumptions if we're aware of the history of interpretations. And I think that's a lesson that we can all learn and apply in whatever intellectual or spiritual or cultural tradition we're a part of. Well, thank you very much. If you'd like to learn more about my interpretations of Chinese thought, including Confucianism and Taoism and other early traditions, I'd invite you to check out my book, Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy. But I'd like to thank you very much for your attentiveness and your interest tonight. And I hope you found something of value in what I've had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Van Norden. That was absolutely wonderful. Just a fascinating overview of all this history and the context of the passages and the history of the interpretation. I never knew this about Husserl and how influential that was. And it's very fascinating in the context of our program, because we've just been talking to our students about the lenses that we bring to the texts that we're reading. And interestingly enough, in our classical Chinese class, when we went over this passage of Jun Jun Chen Chen, the students don't have any background in this, and they kind of, when we discussed that passage, what could this really mean? They kind of got to this idea that there's something important in the relationship of these different roles. So that's very fascinating, that somehow those sort of truths seem to be kind of accessible if you just think about it carefully enough. I want to make sure there's some time for questions. Have you got some questions in your chat? It looks like for everyone.
I do. Yeah, I have a number of questions in chat. I'm sorry, go ahead. I cut you off.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So we'll go ahead and we have about 15 minutes or maybe 14 minutes. And then if we have more than that, what we want to explore, we'll end the event there formally. And then Brian has kindly offered to stay a little longer to discuss further for anyone who wishes to stay, and if we have more questions. Do you need a minute to look those over, Dr. Van Norden?
I can just start to go through them if you want. Yeah, so first, like a very I think the Confucian tradition, I'm interested in it as a scholar, but I also think that philosophy should be a way of life. And so we should try to apply the things we learn to our own life. So I'm going to start with a very kind of personal question. Someone asks, if my parents scold me, what should I do? I'm sometimes confused by it because sometimes I've done nothing wrong. And it's a legitimate question for someone influenced by or interested in the Confucian tradition to ask, because Confucius does say that you can disagree with your parents, but he says that if you cannot convince them, you ultimately have to accept what they tell you to do. However, it's interesting that later in the Confucian tradition, we do get other Confucian philosophers who say that you can sometimes disagree with your parents. So for example, Mengzi, the next major Confucian philosopher, likes to talk about the case of Sage King Shun. And Shun had very abusive parents, and they might even be called evil, and they tried to hurt him and they tried to interfere with his happiness. And so Mengzi says that it was acceptable for Shun to withhold information from his parents in order to secure his own happiness. So I think that Confucians would say that you have to be very understanding of your parents. I'm sympathetic because sometimes I disagreed with my parents growing up. And to this day, I think my parents were wrong about certain things. But I tried to be as respectful of them as I could. But I also, there were times when I had to disagree in my mind or in my heart with them. And that affected what kind of adult I came to be. And I certainly did not have abusive parents, but if your parents are actually abusive, that might require you to distance yourself from your parents or protect yourself in certain ways. And I think that would be consistent with Confucianism as well. So I think a moderate form of Confucianism would say you should try to be respectful of your parents. You should try to forgive them their faults, as we want to be forgiven by other people for our faults. But if parents are genuinely abusive, I think a contemporary Confucian would say that you are allowed to step back and protect yourself and distance yourself from them if they're really genuinely hurting you. So that's it's a very personal kind of question, but I think philosophy should be a way of life. So that's okay. I think that's okay. let's see. So another question. Oh yeah. So what's your perspective on how the rectification of names could lead to ossification when language and the things they relate to are dynamic, evolving things? Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, Confucianism, I like to say that I think Confucianism is not conservative in a certain sense, and that surprises some people. But if you look at, say, Edmund Burke, who's a classic thinker in Western conservatism, Burke's ideas are really about conserving the status and preserving the status quo and making sure that social change occurs slowly and gradually. But that's not what classical Confucianism is really about. That's not what Confucius is doing. Confucius is not defending the status quo in his society. Confucius is calling for a revolution in his society by asking us to live up to the deepest ideas of the Confucian tradition. So there's a way in which we could describe Confucians as revivalists rather than conservatives. And I'd say that Martin Luther King Jr. in the Western tradition is also a revivalist rather than a conservative. Martin Luther King Jr. said that Christianity is about transforming society in a powerful way that's indicated by the Bible, and also the classics of the American tradition, like the Declaration of Independence. And so Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't calling for conserving segregation, but for reviving the deepest meaning of Christianity and also the documents of American political theory to transform the present. Confucius was doing something similar. So I think at its best, the Confucian tradition is revivalistic rather than conservative. Let's see, another question is there ever syntactic or lexical ambiguity in the Analects which affects the interpretation? For example, as a novice learner of classical Chinese, when I see something like Jun, Bu Jun, the ruler isn't a ruler, I'm sometimes unsure what part of speech Jun is. So then I'm not sure whether it means a ruler isn't a ruler, there's a ruler who doesn't act like a ruler, you are not a ruler, you don't act like a ruler, etc. Yeah, there certainly can be, there's ambiguity in every natural human language. And I was just talking earlier today, there's a famous 20th century American philosopher, W.V.O. Quine. And Quine is famous, among other things, for his argument for the indeterminacy of translation. And what that means is there'll always be more than one correct translation of a statement from one language into another language. And I think there's some truth to that. And so it's not just a fact about classical Chinese that there's some ambiguity. I think all natural languages are like that. But one of the ways that we can narrow down interpretations is by asking things like, okay, what do the classic commentaries tell us about the meaning of the text? And what we'll find is that the classic commentaries disagree about how to interpret the text, but that will give us different hypotheses we can try out about the meaning of the text. So sometimes you can help narrow down the range of possible meanings by looking at the commentarial tradition, and then also by asking yourself questions like, okay, as English interpreters, to what extent are we influenced by earlier interpreters like Hu Shi and Feng Youlan, whom we might think are giving us an authentic Chinese interpretation of the text, but ironically are actually influenced a lot by the Western philosophy that they studied, and which they were, especially in the case of Hu Shi, were consciously trying to replicate in the Chinese tradition. Someone else asks, even though these passages like a ruler is not a ruler can be interpreted in a way that does not include names, don't they also presuppose some concept of the true ruler, father, etc., according to the way? In that sense, Husserl and Feng Youlan's interpretation does not seem to deviate too far away. I guess I'm not so clear about the difference between their interpretation and yours. It would be great if we can clarify a bit. That's a great question. I mean, part of the reason I got interested in this is that, especially when I first started studying philosophy, there was a tendency to think that the philosophy of language was central to understanding all of Chinese philosophy from Confucius on. Now, one of the things that we've learned or rediscovered in the last century or so, and this is something that we've learned both with the help of Chinese scholars and also Western scholars, is that early Chinese thinkers, especially beginning with people like Hui Shi and Gongsun Lung, and then later Zhuangzi and Xunzi, were especially interested in the philosophy of language. So there's a period around the 4th century BCE where there's what Arthur Waley called the language crisis in Chinese thought, where people got really interested in the philosophy of language. And you can see that influence on later philosophers like, for example, Zhuangzi and Xunzi. But there were people who said, well, all of Chinese philosophy has always been centrally concerned with names and the philosophy of language. And their evidence for that was primarily the discussion of Zhengming in Analects 13.3. So I tried to find out the history of the way in which people interpreted this passage on Zhengming, the rectification of names, and I became convinced that reading Zhengming as central to all of the Analects and all of early Chinese thought was something that went back to people like Husserl and Feng Youlan being influenced by Western philosophy, which in the period they studied it really did make the philosophy of language central to later discussions. So I'd agree, Confucius certainly cares about the roles that you occupy. And if you're a son or a daughter, he wants you to be a good son or a daughter. If you're a father or a ruler or a mother or a minister, he wants you to be good at that. If you're a student, be a good student. If you're a teacher, be a good teacher. But it doesn't mean he thinks of these roles primarily in terms of names. You could phrase it that way, but doesn't seem to be the way that Confucius primarily thinks about it. And even in the passages where he talks about it, he doesn't phrase it in terms of names. So it is a subtle distinction, but I think it's worth marking because the philosophy of language was so central to English language philosophy in the 20th century that it's tempting to project that onto Chinese philosophy. And like I say, the irony is Husserl and Feng Youlan, who are great thinkers, don't get me wrong, but they're great thinkers who were consciously trying to model the study of Chinese philosophy on the study of Western philosophy. But their words had a lot of prestige in the West because they were Chinese thinkers explaining Chinese thought. And people thought they were representative of the Chinese tradition. But the irony is they're actually representative more of the Western tradition under which they studied. Let's see what some other these are great questions. How does one come into questioning their own belief system while reading a text? So one way you can do this, again, I always stress this, is looking at the way different commentators in the tradition have interpreted the texts. Because what you find in every tradition is that there are sincere believers who are very conversant with the text. They know them very well, yet they still disagree about how to interpret them. And so I remember I had a colleague who taught the history of Christian thought at Stanford. And he happened to be a Christian himself. And so many students wanted to take his course because they were Christians and they wanted to learn about Christianity from a Christian professor. And this professor, I talked to him and he said, I would give them a history of Christian thought and show them the diversity among sincere Christian thinkers. And then at the end of the course, they would come to me and say, yes, but which one of them is the authentic Christian interpretation? And the professor would have to say, I can't tell you that. I can just tell you that sincere, intelligent Christians have disagreed about how to understand what Christianity is about. And you have to decide what you think Christianity is about. I think you find the same thing in Judaism, in Islam, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, from what I've seen, in Confucianism, in Taoism. In each of these traditions, people read it differently. So it helps stretch your own interpretation by seeing how did other people in your tradition read these texts differently. And that's kind of a shock when you first encounter it, but you'll find this in every tradition. So that's one way to start. Dr. Van Norden, I have these questions. You did mention the importance of correctly rectifying names. How can we recognize an object and identify a wrong name? Well, I mean, part of it is you get examples from the classic texts of how rulers are supposed to act and how they're not supposed to act, or how good teachers act and bad teachers act, and good students act and bad students act. Confucius said at one point, if I'm, walking with two other people, I'm sure to learn something from them, because I will find the bad points in their character and I'll see if I have those bad points in my own character, and I'll look at the good points in their character and I'll aspire to realize the good points in their characters. So from every example you read about how families function well or they function badly, or what a good student is or a bad student is, you can find lessons for yourself in terms of what it means to be a good student for you, or it means to be a good Buddhist for you, or a good Christian for you. And by looking at examples of bad Christians or bad Buddhists, you can learn for yourself examples of how to be a good or bad at these different things. So that's one way in which you can learn things. I'm just going to skip down to some other questions. Very nice compliments, thank you. Using the term philosophy as an example, could you please share what your strategy is when rectifying names in translation, especially when the terms might be context specific? Yeah, I can give you some examples of how to rectify names in translation. So for example, Confucius has a lot of disciples, and one thing that I think is hard for people to understand in reading the Analects is it's tempting to think of disciples as being like students, especially because Confucius talks a lot about 学, which can be translated as study. But really, 学 is not purely academic study. And what Confucius's disciples are doing is not what academic students do. They're really learning to be better people. And as a teacher, I hope that my teaching has a positive effect on my students' characters. And I sometimes am honored that students will write me years later and talk about how much something I taught them meant to them and affected their life in a positive way. And I'm always touched by that. But at the end of the day, I realize I'm just a teacher. I'm not a master like Kongzi is. And my students are not my disciples. Why not? Because for a master-disciple relationship is a particular kind of relationship in which the master takes responsibility for your moral development. I hope I'll have a positive effect on the moral development of my students, but that's not my job or my prerogative as a contemporary academic teacher. It's just my job to teach. So that's a way in which our contemporary understanding of the teacher-student relationship is not analogous perfectly to the master-disciple relationship. And so part of translating these terms into English isn't just coming up with a label like, well, Zi means master and Dizi means disciple. It's also explaining to the students what the connotations of these terms are and how those connotations may be different from the most similar relationships we have in our own society, which might be a teacher and student.
Dr. Van Norden,
Yes, of course.
this is wonderful, and we're going to continue this, but I just want to formally end the event in case anyone needs to leave. Thank you so much for coming to us from the internets and delivering such a wonderful talk. I'd also like to thank everyone who's joined the talk today, and I hope you'll come to our future events. If you have any questions, you can always email the Symposium team at symposium@drbu.edu, and everybody's welcome to stay for more questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all very much for coming, but I completely understand I'm sure it's getting late, so you certainly
Getting
are.
later for you, but all
But
right.
yeah, if people are going to hang around, another question is, would the term Cheng, sincerity, also be a later idea or an idea from the original source? Would Cheng make sense with the rectifying names? Yeah, that's a great question. Cheng, which we often render sincerity, is clearly an important concept in later Confucian philosophy. It certainly is a term that appears as a general purpose adverb, meaning truly or sincerely in classical Chinese. But near the end of the classical period, so sometime in like the 3rd century BCE, it starts to get used as a technical term in philosophy. And then in works like The Great Learning and The Mean, which become very influential in later Chinese thought and later Confucianism, the term comes to be a kind of a technical term, where Cheng refers to sincerity in the sense of being true to your genuine self. So in English, we often say, we might say of somebody, well, he's really a jerk, but at least he's sincere. And what you mean by that is, well, they're a bad person, but at least they're honest about how they actually feel. So in English, sincerity or authenticity refers to being honest about how you actually feel and living according to the principles that you espouse. But in the Confucian tradition, Cheng isn't just being honest or avoiding hypocrisy. Cheng is a matter of being true to your true nature as a human being, which is, according to the later Confucian tradition, a virtuous nature, a good nature. So to be sincere, Cheng, in the later Confucian tradition, is to genuinely be who you are in your deepest self, not merely honest or avoiding insincerity. And again, the later tradition thinks that you find this idea in Confucius, but I think it's a notion that develops a little later in the tradition, like in the 3rd century BCE, and then becomes really central in the Sung and Ming dynasties with thinkers like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming. So that's a great question. Let me see. If rectifying names is only a policy, then are you claiming that Confucius is a hypocrite? And so, well, no, I don't mean to say that. What I mean to say is rectifying names, I think in its original context, it's a comment on the political situation in the state of Wei. And it's a reference to the fact that, look, what you had in the state of Wei was if rumors are to be believed, a wife who was not acting like a wife should act, a stepson who was not acting like a stepson should act, a father who was not acting like a father should act, and a son who was not acting like a son should act. And I think that is what rectifying names means. I think that's how Xunzi later understood it. And I think that's a perfectly sensible thing for Confucius to say in the State of Wei. And notice it's also a discrete comment, because Confucius hasn't come out and said, boy, Nanza's a terrible wife, and Kwai Kwei, oh, he's a terrible stepson, and Zhe, oh, he's a terrible son, and Kwai Kwei is also a horrible dad. He just said, no, I would rectify names personally. And Zulu's like, what are you talking about? That wasn't to do with anything. And you can just see Confucius rolling his eyes like, oh, Zulu, come on, don't you get what I'm saying? You should be quiet about things you don't understand, Zulu. And so it's Confucius's way of subtly critiquing people's behavior in the State of Wei without specifically, ironically, naming names about who is doing the wrong thing. You just say there are people around here who are important and they're not living up to their roles as named by titles, but he's been very discreet about it. But that doesn't make him hypocritical. That just makes him, he's referencing a particular context instead of making a general recommendation. Let's see. Yeah, Zhengming seems to reflect a universal need regardless of culture or race. Take Queen Elizabeth II passing away. One of the first things the royal family did was to Zhengming ID to update the titles of William and Kate in order to indicate their responsibilities and new roles. Yeah, there's a sense in which, we can learn a universal lesson from rectifying names. And again, my point is a subtle one. It's just, do we think that rectifying names is something that is operative in lots of passages in the Analects, including many passages that don't mention names at all? And do we think it is a concept that is operative throughout Chinese philosophy from the earliest periods on down to the end of the pre-Qin period? And my suggestion is it's not, because I think 13.3 looks like it's a late addition to the text. Even if we take it in its own terms, it seems like it's really focused on the political situation in Wei, because that's what Confucius does. He tempers his comments to his particular interlocutors in a particular situation. And the tendency to think that Chinese philosophy is all organized around the philosophy of language is something that you would be tempted to think if you were deeply influenced by 20th century English language philosophy. And ironically, Hu Shi and Feng Youlan were very influenced by that. So, but I think you're right. Certainly every philosopher, not just Confucius, thinks that we have to use words correctly, and thinks that some ways of using words are correct and some are incorrect. But that's not distinctive of Confucianism. That's a feature of all philosophy. So is rectifying names something that's distinctive of Confucianism or that's operative almost throughout the text? Well, that's what I'm calling into question anyway. Let's see. There are some, yes, Sarah Babcock, thank you. There are some comments about Hu Shi and whether he influenced the Chinese way of viewing these concepts. There might be some negative views of Hu Shi from our Chinese audience. Yeah, Hu Shi is a controversial figure, as is Feng Youlan. I think that I'll say this much, that I think that they had a substantial influence on how Westerners approached the Analects. And again, I think the reason they had so much influence was out of charitable motives on the part of Western interpreters. So Western interpreters thought, I, as a Westerner, they thought, want to learn from Chinese thinkers about their tradition. So when they saw the English translation by Dirk Body of Feng Youlan's A History of Chinese Philosophy, they picked it up, and it became the best-selling history of Chinese philosophy in English, because they said, oh, great, a Chinese person is going to tell me about their tradition. But the irony is that Feng Youlan's not representative of most Chinese interpretations. But what I'm noticing now is I'm increasingly seeing some contemporary Chinese interpreters who are reproducing the views of people like Feng Youlan in reading Chinese philosophy, including thinkers in the Mingjia, the school of names, like Hui Shi and Gong Songlong. And I've been surprised to see Chinese interpreters reproduce some of these ideas that I saw in Feng Youlan, because I thought these were just Platonistic ways of reading these texts that only Westerners had picked up. But I am seeing some Chinese interpreters nowadays reading them in the same way. But I agree, for a long time, Hu Shi and Feng Youlan were not as influential in Chinese sources. I'm just looking at other questions. Thank you very much for all your nice comments. What do you see the future of sinology in this country when US-China relationship worsens and deteriorates? Is there any hope for the broadening the scope and depth of sinology? Well, I really hope so. I think there's too much anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States right now, and I certainly oppose it. And there are many Americans who oppose the anti-Chinese sentiments in the United States right now, and I do all I can to oppose these views. And it's like anything else. All we can do is try to contribute in our own small way to greater understanding and to opposing racism and nationalism when we encounter it. And so I try to help in my own small way, and I think we can all do what we can to oppose racism and nationalism when we encounter it. I am finding in the last few years increasing acceptance and interest in Chinese philosophy and philosophical circles. So I think the US is in a very tenuous crisis point, where there are some forces pulling towards nationalism and xenophobia and racism. But I'm convinced the vast majority of Americans don't believe in those things and are fighting for greater understanding and acceptance and love of various traditions. And I'm finding much more interest and openness towards Chinese philosophy and other kinds of non-Western philosophy among students and faculty in the last few years than I did for a long time before then. So I'm actually cautiously optimistic, but this is a precarious moment in history, I agree. Let's see. So someone wonders, is reforming objects to be appropriate with the name? Could this cause suffering? If it causes suffering, is it appropriate to do it? Yeah, it depends on the circumstances. So, for example, I think that we should be very tolerant and accepting of people who might not match our conception, for example, of traditionally what a woman is. And so you might think you know what a woman is, or you can define what a woman is. But if someone identifies as a woman and that maybe doesn't meet a traditional conception of what a woman is, but they're happy with who they are and they're not hurting anyone else, then I think we should be accepting of them. Same thing about what being a man is. And so some people might live as a man in a way that might be different from your conception of what a man is, but we should, I think, be open-minded and accepting of people in a way that minimizes the suffering of others. And so I think that's a good guide. So I think that whatever we think rectifying names is and whatever role we think it has in Confucianism, it should not be an excuse for inflicting suffering on others or for being needlessly judgmental of others. One of my favorite Confucian sayings is that a noble person is demanding of themselves, but tolerant of others. And so I think that's a good thing to focus on. Be the best person you can be, and don't focus on being too judgmental about others. A lot of thank you very much for your compliments. I'm seeing a lot of charming, generous compliments. Oh, I might have come to the end of the questions. Yeah, I think I might have come to the end of questions. But thank you very much for these wonderful questions and for staying with me to listen to them. And I appreciate very much your attentiveness. I hope you found something of value in what I've had to say. And I look forward to continuing the conversation on some other occasion.
Thank you, Professor. We really hope that you can come visit us sometime. So please let us know if you're ever over in California, and you can come read some classical Chinese with our students. We had a few students curious about your classical Chinese book. And what is your definition of a beginner? That was one question of what he said.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's hard to know where to start. It's funny, a colleague of mine is working on a book, Sanskrit for Everybody, a guide for absolute beginners. And it was a funny experience because I read one of the drafts of it and I said, wow, this is kind of hard. And so I kind of know what my students must feel like, when they're trying to learn characters at the very first time. And so me trying to learn Sanskrit, I could kind of appreciate how hard it must be for my students. So I tried to make it as simple as I could, but I'm sure it still is very challenging, and I appreciate the effort that people have made to try to learn it.
They're getting a lot out of it, for sure. Well, thank you very much, and I hope we'll have another opportunity to have you as a guest. Thank you, everyone. I can't believe this, but we have 96 people still hanging on. So thanks everyone for showing up and continuing, and please join our future events, and we'll see everyone again soon, I hope. Dr. Van Norden, have a wonderful evening. We'll be in touch, and get a good night's sleep.
Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your night. And again, thank you everyone so much for coming and listening to my talk. I appreciate it very much.